Welcome back to the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. In this video, we're going to be adding a configuration system to our Blazor WebAssembly project so we can extract our hard-code authentication values and put them in somewhere we can replace them at runtime. That will prepare our application for deployment to Azure. Now, for those of you who are subscribers to my Patreon at the $5 per month level or higher, head on over to get the source code for today's video. That'll give you a good copy to compare your code to in the case you run into an issue. Let's jump right into Visual Studio. Now, we're in the Blazor project, so called Portal. And in here, we have some hard-coded stuff. So for example, in the authentication services.cs file, right down here, we have our API URL, which is hard-coded. That's not going to work going forward because we need to change this at deployment time because every deployment server will have a different API. Now, in most projects, like say our API project, we have the concept of appsettings.json. But in our Blazor WebAssembly project, we don't have that. In fact, if you look here, there is no appsettings.json file. Now, don't worry, we can add one. But here's the reason why it's not included by default. I think, this is my opinion. And my opinion is that it's not included by default because we don't want to encourage you to use your configuration file to store anything sensitive. Remember that Blazor WebAssembly sends all of your code down to the client, and it's readable on the client, which means that includes your appsettings.json file. So if you put anything in there, the client can read that information. So you cannot put a database connection string there. You cannot put a username and password for a service or an API there. You can't put private tokens there. So it's a very limited use from an app set or from a web perspective compared to the other .NET Core projects. The other .NET Core projects live on the server. And so we do put connection strings and private tokens and other things that we need to store safely and privately and yet give our application access to. So there is some limitations here, but for our purposes, that's not a problem. We only need to store our token, or our API path to our get our token, and we need to store this auth token key. I want to put that in there as well. That we can change what we store in local storage, whether we call it auth token now, but maybe down the road we call it something different, or on certain clients we want to call it something different. We can go ahead and make that change and it won't be a problem. So we're going to extract those two values and put them into a configuration file for our project. So step one here is to go to our www root folder. Now in here are files that we get copied over to the root of our web project. In fact, this is the root of our web project. And from there, our application will get put into it, essentially is how it's going to work. What that means is we can add a file here like appsettings.json, and it will get brought over into our published web application. So right click and say add new item. You can just search for JSON here. And the first result should be appsettings file, which is appsettings.json. And there we go. Now it does put by default a connection string in there. Do not use that. We don't want that connection string there because we don't even want to pretend like we're going to use a connection string. Don't put connection strings in WebAssembly, okay? All right, so we need now to talk about how to access this file. Well, it's actually built right in. So even though we don't have in Blazor WebAssembly the appsettings.json file by default, the iConfiguration system that we use in our API and other ASP.NET Core projects, that's still available to us here it still will load app-settings.json and app-settings.development.json and so on into our into memory and then read from that. It will still use those 5 different versions of our settings files. So really, we're done as far as bringing this into our project. We just need to add the file. Now, I'm not going to create a .development version because I'm going to use my main app-settings.json file as my local testing version. And then whenever we deploy it somewhere, we'll change the values. That way, we never have a mistake. We never cause a problem where we are causing issues by having the wrong configuration or sensitive data in here. It's always going to be local testing only. We can overwrite this with a secrets.json if you really wanted to, but we're not going to. We're just going to put it right in app-settings.json and be fine. So the first value I want to put in here is our API URL. In fact, I think there should be 2 values, and here's why. Eventually, we're going to want to talk to this API. In fact, I think if not the next lesson, the lesson after that, we're going to be loading in information like which groups are you in. Right now, we hard-coded that. We're going to switch that over to be dynamic. So we need to call the API. And of course, later we'll call the API to get data, to load inventory, to add to the inventory, and so on. So we need the path to the API, which is this part right here. Now we also need where to get the token from, which in our case is just /token. So I think what we'll do is we'll put this in 2 different values. That way, when it comes to just accessing the API, we can use just this value. When it comes to accessing the token specifically, we can access both of them and put them together. So let's start off with calling this the API location. And in here, we will put this value right here without the / at the end. We'll put a comma. Next, we'll put the token endpoint and /token. Okay, so those 2 values there will get concatenated together. So we have API location and token endpoint. Now, before we get to calling that, there's a third thing I want to do, and that's this right here, which is the name of our local storage place for our authentication token. So I'm going to copy, well, I'm not going to copy this. Let's just call it over here, auth storage, our auth token storage key. Okay, and that'll be the key where we're going to store the authentication key. All right, so when we get our authentication token, we're going to store that in this location, using this key. So the key will be auth token, and of course the value will be our authentication token. So we'll replace this hard-coded value with that value from the app settings. So now we have our 3 values in our app settings.json file. Let's save that. Let's go back here and start using it. So come back to the top here, and we're going to put a comma in our constructor and ask for iConfiguration, which that probably added a using statement right here. It did for Microsoft.extensions.configuration. So iConfiguration, and we'll call this config, and then do a control dot here to create and assign that field. So it just created that entry right there and that entry right there. Oh, sorry, that entry right there. There we go. Now we brought in our iConfiguration, which is using dependency injection to inject that iConfiguration, which is set up at the very beginning for us. Let me just point this out. In program.cs, when we have the create defaults right here, this is setting up the defaults for eye configuration, for logging, and for other things by default for us. We can override those defaults. And if you want to talk more about or learn more about app settings and how to do that, I do have a video here on this channel on app settings. I also have a course on I Am Tim Corey called App Settings in Depth. So we go into even more detail on how to set these app settings up. But this eye configuration here, we'll use this to access our configuration. So let's come down here, and the first place is right here. I'm going to create a new value, and this will be our API. Let's call it API is fine. Equals, and then we'll concatenate our two values together, which is going to be config, and we'll ask for the key. So the key is going to be our API location. So that will return for us this value right here, will return for us this value right here. Now I just need a token endpoint. We can just do a plus and config and put token endpoint there. And now we should have our API location and then our token location, which gives us this right here. Now, you may be asking, why did I do the plus here instead of, for example, string interpolation, where you put the $sign in front of a string? And the reason why is because we really are just appending two strings to each other, and therefore the plus works just fine, and there is no performance difference doing it this way versus string interpolation. So it makes my code a little cleaner to do it this way, and it's really easy to read what it's doing. So we replace this right here with API. Okay, so now we've taken out that hard-coded URL. That's the first place we needed to check. Now we have down here auth token, and we have down here auth token in two different methods. So let's go back to the top, and in our constructor, let's actually outside here first say private string, and this is going to be our auth token storage key. Let's just call it that. And we'll assign it a value after config. So auth storage token key equals config, like so. And now we can use this in place of auth token here and auth token here. So that takes care of the hard coding there. Now note that you may see bearer and go, wait, Tim, should we replace bearer? No, we shouldn't, because we are using bearer tokens, and that's a common thing. It's not a thing you necessarily change. So that's fine to have hard code there because it's a hard code value. So we can leave that as such. So now everything else, same thing here, grant type, username, and password, those are hard-coded requirements. In theory, if you wanted to get really technical about it, you could replace these and say, oh, I hate all, hard-coded strings. But you're gonna have to hard code it somewhere. I mean, and if you don't, if you say, well, I'm gonna put in app settings.json, okay, but you're clogging up your app settings.json for something that will not change. Is that really worth all the additional complexity? And the answer for me is no. I try and keep my complexity as low as possible. So if I can leave this like so, which I can, because even if we changed APIs, it's gonna have to have this setup. So otherwise you have to change our entire class file for this. We have to change our entire authentication system. So this is gonna be the same way, even with a different API. Even if we switch between our development server, our testing server, our staging server, our pre-production server, our production server, however many different servers we have with the APIs, they will all use the same system. So there's no reason not to hard code this. Now we're not quite done yet, because there's also in this auth state provider, we look down here, we have auth token. If you miss this, then what'll happen is it'll still work because you've called it auth token until someone changes this. and then it won't work. And then you'll be wondering why. Okay, so that's the only thing here. Authentication type, that's fine to be hard code because that's the type we're using, and we're not going to change that type. So therefore, this is the only thing to be changed right here, which means we need to bring in the I configuration. Again, it's going to add that using statement at the top. And we'll do the same thing here, control dot to create and assign our fields. Let's also wrap this. So quick actions and refactoring. And we'll wrap every parameter like so. That looks better. And now we don't have to do the global variable or the class level variable because we're just getting it in one place, which is right here. So therefore, we can say, let's actually grab it from right here. That we call the same thing. So string, auth token, storage key, and then we can pass that in right there. And now we have replaced this hard code value with a value coming from our configuration file. Now, the moment of truth, let's get this started and see if it runs. So if it runs, it should be able to log in and log out of the API. So we have started the WPF project off screen. Now the Blazor server project starts, and it started. So let's log out first. Make sure we're logged out. We're not authenticated. Let's log in. And we'll see what happens. It seems to be logged in, and yes, we are logged in. It's verified, we're authenticated. It's found those two roles, but not the third role. We don't have access to the manager role. So we're all good. We can log out as well. It still works. So our authentication system still works, and yet we've taken out the hard coding of the API and also the token location in storage. What that means is we can also, let's close this all down and go back to our code. We can go to our app settings.json, and just for fun, we can change this to Tim's token. And we'll change it back before we commit it to storage control. But I want to make sure that we are in fact using that location properly. So we're going to boot this up, and once our Blazor app starts, which it did, we can go to F12 here and look at our, we don't have any tokens here, so let's close this out. We'll go to login. We'll log back in. And once we log in, we can go back to F12 and look, it says now, let's zoom in here. It says Tim's token for the token name. And yet, if we go to use this, we can still use it just fine. Doesn't matter where we're storing it, what we're calling it in local storage. So if you want to change the name of it, cool, go ahead. It's not going to break anything. So let's do this. Let's close out without logging out. Okay, and we'll go back to Visual Studio, and I'm going to change this back to auth token, and we're going to start up again. So once it starts up, we're going to check to see if we're logged in. So verify auth, we're not authenticated. Yet if we hit F12, you'll see that Tim's token is in fact there. And the reason why we're not authenticated is because we're not using the correct token. Now if I create this token, or create this login, it will create the token, and we'll have two tokens. One that says auth token, and one that says Tim's token. So we can delete that. But that's just verifying that yes, in fact, we are using that naming correctly. It is reading it, and we have successfully talked to our app settings.json file, and we're all set. Now, since this is a shorter topic, I do want to spend a little bit of time and do some cleanup while we're here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit the change we've made so far. So just these changes. Let's just say add config file. removed hard-coded values and added them to the app settings file. All right, we'll commit that. We won't push it yet, but we will commit it. And now we're ready to go again on the next set of changes. So let's close out all of this. And right now we've never really cleaned up our project. So we still have some sample stuff laying around. For example, in our pages, we have the counter page, which we don't need this. Now we've tested that out using the claim types to see if they're authorized or not. That's cool, but we don't need it anymore. We have the verify auth page, so we can delete this. And we have the fetch data page, which we again use for testing to show if we can log onto it or not based upon our role. So that was cool. Again, we have our verify auth page. We don't need this. Also note it uses a sample data weather.json file. So we're going to delete this. And we're also going to go to our www root, go to sample data. There's just weather.json, so we'll delete the entire thing. We don't need that. And now let's go to our navigation page. In our navigation page, we have counter and fetch data. We can get rid of both of those. We do have our login, log out, and verify authentication. We're going to leave those for now because in the next video, we're going to be adding a bar at the top that shows us our login status. If we're logged in, logged out, if we're logged in, what our email address is. If we're logged out, the fact we can a login button, also a register button, which we'll have to add registration at some point as well. So, but now we at least have those things cleaned up. Also notice under models, or no, we cleaned that up. I think that's all cleaned up. So I don't think there's any more sample data around. We do have a survey prompt. Let's get rid of that. And that means on our index page, we should get rid of the survey prompt right here. And I think that will be all the stuff we need to get rid of. I don't see anything else in here that is, still outstanding or still referencing deleted stuff. And I don't think we have any other sample data in here. So let's just kind of cleans things up. Let's run it to make sure that nothing broke. We had no errors. It's always good to run things after you make changes just to make sure you're not missing something important. So we have our about, which just links to blazor.net. I'm going to leave that right there for now because this is where the login, log out is going to reside. So we're going to have the login status up there. We don't have a counter or the weather data over here. We just have login, log out, and whoops, I clicked log out, therefore we're logged out. I forgot I did that already. So, but that's good. That's all we need is those 4 buttons for right now. They're all the same icon, but we're gonna take these away once we put them up here. So I'm fine with leaving them where they're at and not worrying about changing things we don't need to. So now I've kind of cleaned up our Blazor project so it's no longer that starter template stuff and there's not kind of artifacts left behind from the samples that the template gives you. So I think we're set for this lesson. Going forward, we're going to add the login information, like I said, to the top bar right here. And then after that, we'll add the ability to register. Right now we have log in and log out, but there's no way to sign up for an account, which is kind of important if you are trying to use our web app to buy something, right? So we'll add that registration as well. Maybe not in the next video, maybe the video after that. We'll see how long it takes to set up the login information the way you want it, okay? That's coming up in the next video. Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.